Welcome back in. Welcome back in. So today we're going to be discussing some of my favorite deep league waiver ads. Now, these are players that are rostered in less than 1% of leagues. So the majority of these should be available in most leagues. Now, these aren't going to be for your typical 10-team league, stuff like that with short benches, because a lot of these guys just aren't really going to be worth you to roster at this point. But at the very least, should be players you have in the back of your mind. But for deeper leagues, 12 teams and above, I think a lot of these guys are going to be helpful because one of the biggest advantages you can get in fantasy football is already having a player roster before they go off. So some of these running backs, I think you could be looking at as handcuffs that nobody's really talking about, or there's not a lot of hype surrounding them right now. So let's go ahead and get into it and stop wasting your time. And we're going to start at the running back position. First, let's talk about KeShawn Vaughn for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He has leapfrogged Sean Tucker on the depth chart in week 4. He ended up seeing 10 opportunities to 18 to Rachaad White. We have seen KeShawn Vaughn produce in the past. Rachaad White has largely been terrible as a runner for so far this season. He did have the one good game against the Bears, but on the season, he's averaging a rough 3.1 yards per carry. Now, the problem is the guy that a lot of people liked was Sean Tucker hasn't done anything. He's actually been worse. He's actually averaged 1.5 yards per carry. So he's been absolutely dreadful so far to start the season. Now, KeShawn Vaughn, I think, could actually carve himself out an early down workload role here within this offense if Rachaad White continues to struggle. Rachaad White is a good pass catcher out of the backfield, and that's not something that's necessarily KeShawn Vaughn's strong suit. Like, he can catch passes, but he's not somebody that I would consider a good pass catching running back like you would Rachaad White. So I do think KeShawn Vaughn should definitely be on a lot of people's radars. Next up, I want to talk about Emari Demercado. He is from the Arizona Cardinals, and I'm going to promise you that you're probably not going to hear anything about him, but you probably should. He is a 2023 UDFA, and he's probably my favorite guy that's on this list altogether. He is 5'10", 215 pounds. He ran a 4.49 40, and he has a 79 percentile agility score. He's starting to see an expanded workload. In week 1, he only played 5% of the snaps, but in week 4, he played 36% of the snaps. Now you have injury-prone James Conner ahead of him, but we're starting to see the Cardinals lowering his usage as well. His snaps went from 83% in week 1 all the way down to 60% in week 4, and this has just kind of been a trend we've seen so far through the first 4 weeks of the season. Now, in week 4, Demercado had 1 carry for 3 yards, but he had 4 targets, 3 catches for 21 yards. Demercado, it definitely has the size to be a every down workhorse back. So if something were to happen to James Conner, I do think it would be Emari Demercado who gets that opportunity over Keontae Ingram. He's already jumped him on the depth chart. So, and with his pass catching involvement, that also is a bright spot as well. So I think even Demercado could actually carve out his own role as a pass catcher within this backfield anyway. So he is certainly somebody that I want to add right now and not wait for something to happen later. Next up, let's talk about Pierre Strong through the Cleveland Browns. He was traded from New England to Cleveland earlier in the season, but he is third on the team with a 14% snap share, 23% of the rush attempts, and 7% of the routes. Last week, he had 5 carries for 49 yards. The week before that, he had 6 carries for 27 yards. He is by far more explosive than Kareem Hunt is at this point. Kareem Hunt is definitely still going to get work. And if something were to happen to Jerome Ford, I don't know exactly if Kareem Hunt would be the guy that just steps right in and handles 60, 70% of the snaps. I don't know if that would be the case. I do think there's a scenario here if Pierre Strong continues to have these productive weeks like he is and showing what he can do, because we forget Pierre Strong, though he went to a small school, was uber productive and was one of the best just athletes coming out of the draft last season. So there is a lot of juice here with Pierre Strong. So next up, let's talk about Chris Rodriguez Jr., 6th-round pick out of the University of Kentucky. He did not play last week because of an illness, but he is 6 foot, 217 pounds. Now, he's only received 3 carries all season. However, he is a likely replacement for Brian Robinson, I do think, if he were to miss some time. He was solid in the preseason with 17 carries for 122 yards. He was also 11th in yards after contact per attempt during the preseason. And I just think that he is a more logical fit for this offense. I don't think Antonio Gibson would be the guy who just takes over. They don't really seem to love Antonio Gibson regardless of that. And there was a lot of buzz in the preseason of how much they really like Chris Rodriguez. So I do think if something were to happen to Brian Robinson, he would be the natural handcuff here within this backfield. So lastly, just some other options. I think Rico Dowdle is kind of interesting if something happened to Tony Pollard, because I don't think it would be Deuce Vaughn, but I also think it's possible they could go out and freeze if something happened to Tony Pollard, knock on wood, definitely. And then the other situation is kind of this Bengals situation. You have Trayon Williams here as the backup to Joe Mixon, but Trayon Williams has been on this offense for at least the last couple of seasons and has really never had an opportunity to really do anything. So I think that is a little bit of a red flag for him. But Chase Brown is somebody they invested in, super productive running back out of the University of Illinois. Very athletic running back as well, but he hasn't been given any opportunities, although he's been active. I do think that he's kind of the one that I think has a lot more juice if something happened to Joe Mixon. But right now, Joe Mixon handles so much of this workload in this backfield. It's going to take an injury to Joe Mixon for somebody to really stand out here within this group. So next up, let's jump over to the wide receivers really quickly. Now, it should be said with wide receivers. Wide receivers are a little bit different of a breed when it comes to running backs. All I'm really looking for is some opportunity here for some of these guys and kind of seeing what they've been able to do. And these would be guys in definitely deep leagues that you would be looking to add, but certainly names that you should have on your list. So one that I would say Terrace Marshall is probably able to roster any 12-team league. Marshall has hauled in 9 of the 10 targets yesterday for 56 yards. Marshall has also seen an expanded role with Jonathan Mingo sidelined with concussion, but Marshall has now received 18 targets over his last 2 games, and the Panthers are definitely going to be in some positive passing game scripts here over the next 2 games against the Lions and Dolphins. So Terrace Marshall rostered in less than 1% of leagues. I think if Terrace Marshall is going to continue to see this type of opportunity in this wide receiver room, he is worth a look, though I don't know how high his ceiling really can go. Next up, now, the rest of these guys are probably going to take an injury for something to really expand their role, but we're starting to see a little bit more usage out of somebody like Cedric Tilman for the Browns. He is a 3rd-round pick, 6'3", 213 pounds. He has a 79th percentile burst score with a 4.54 40. He had a 26.9% college target share in college, which is 81st percentile at the University of Tennessee. Now, this last week was a little bit interesting because he really saw a little bit of a jump in terms of opportunity. 19% of the routes, he was 38% target per route run rate with a 10% target share and a 17.33 average depth of target and 19% air yards. He did only have 1 catch for 5 yards on 3 targets, but it was good to see some opportunity here for the 3rd-round pick. I do think it would take an injury probably to Donovan Peoples-Jones or Amari Cooper for him to really see an expanded role within this offense right now, because I don't think he would be a logical fit for somebody like Elijah Moore for what he does, but I think he's much more of a better replacement for like a DPJ or an Amari Cooper. So Cedric Tillman should definitely be on your radar. Tyler Scott, Chase Claypool likely out in Chicago. Scott would be a logical replacement for something happened to Darnell Mooney. They're very similar in terms of their archetype and kind of what they bring to the table. Scott was quiet in week 4 while only running 18% of the routes, but he did see 2 carries for 19 yards. But he is 5'11", 185 pounds. He ran a 4.44 40. His 95th percentile burst. He was an early declare 4th-round pick out of the University of Cincinnati. But as the season goes on, it's hard to imagine the Bears don't try to see what they have in Tyler Scott and somebody that had a little bit of a buzz. Next up, let's talk about Jaylen Tolbert. He was a 2022 3rd-round pick, but he's starting to see a little bit of action on the season. He has ran 34% of the routes, 7% target share, and targeted on 17% of the routes. He had a decent day this past Sunday, hauling in 4 passes for 53 yards and a blowout of the Patriots, but he would likely need to see an injury because as of right now, he's the number 4 wide receiver on the depth chart. But if something were to happen, like a Brandon Cooks or a Michael Gallup or even a CeeDee Lamb, Jaylen Tolbert could actually have quite a bit of juice here within this Cowboys offense. So Jaylen Tolbert, I think, is worth a look in really deep formats. And then lastly, Demario Douglas from the Patriots. He's the number 4 wide receiver at this point, but it's not hard, and you don't really have to squint too hard to see a path to targets for him. With Devontae Parker and Juju Smith-Schuster and Kendrick Bourne, none of these dudes are really anything to really be worried about. But Douglas did see 7 targets in week 1, but he hasn't seen more than 3 over the last 3 weeks. He is running 34% of the routes with a 10% target share on the season. But so Demario Douglas, I think, is kind of another option here we could be looking at because there's been a lot of reports about Juju Smith-Schuster's knee. So if he were to miss some time, or a Devontae Parker who's never really been able to stay healthy either, I think there is a clear path for Demario Douglas. So he is kind of a worth of a speculative ad, somebody you could put on your bench if something were to happen to these other guys. So lastly, some honorable mention. A.T. Perry, again, would need an injury probably to Michael Thomas or something like that to really be fantasy relevant. But A.T. Perry absolutely balled out in the preseason. I'm kind of sad that he hasn't really been given any other opportunity. But right now, he's been a really kind of a healthy scratch behind guys like Keith Kirkwood and, some other options. But, right now, the top 3 guys are locked in as Olave, Michael Thomas, Rashid Shaheed. So it would take probably an injury or possibly even 2 for A.T. Perry to become fantasy relevant. And then lastly, it's Xavier Hutchinson for the Texans. He had a lot of buzz heading into the season as well, but he really hasn't been involved and done a whole lot there either. But, if something happened like a Robert Woods or, they fall out of contention and they want to see what some of these guys have, Xavier Hutchinson could be a name to monitor. And then Justin Ross, I have him on here because he plays for the Chiefs, but it's frustrating because they just don't really utilize his type of archetype. You have to go back to Sammy Watkins, really as somebody that was more of a big body wide receiver to really look at somebody like this. But Justin Ross certainly has the talent, but he's right now is number 7 wide receiver for the Chiefs. So let me know in the comment section below what you think of this list. Maybe some guys, some situations you're looking at, maybe who you would look to drop if you wanted to add one of these guys. But with that being said, hit that like and subscribe button for future content. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.